There are no rules in tabletop role-playing game. If you say there are rules in tabletop role-playing game, it means you do not play tabletop role-playing games. Bonk, bonk, bonk. The OSR is pretty much dead. It's just old school gamers now. The OSR is just clones of old games. Turns out there is no Shermer Illinois. The first rule of Fight Club is don't talk about Fight Club. Hello and welcome, my friends. It's a rare live broadcast on this Friday morning at 10 o'clock. That's the 7th day of January 2024. 55 degrees and cloudy, but the rain seems to be gone. And we're doing a episode of Tabletop Role-Playing Game Controversy Jeopardy, or This Week in Tabletop Role-Playing Game Stupid. I did have to change one word from the above because it was referring to a very specific game that we're not talking about for an entire month. But other than that, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. This first one comes to us via our friend Elvin Maiden. Check her out, link down below. She's got some awesome stuff going on. Much praise and support for her as she has been dealing with an internet troll for the past week who has come and approached us with this very interesting idea. There are no rules in tabletop role-playing. If you say there are rules, it means you don't play tabletop role-playing. And this comes from the fact that it says Player's Handbook or Game Master's Guide or Monster Manual. It doesn't say rules. So this individual would have us think that because it doesn't say rule book on the cover of game, it doesn't have rules. So I'm just going to look at a couple games I have in my shelf to see what they say on the cover. This one says game. This one says a complete beginner's guide for role-playing game. This one says role-playing in the 80s it never was role-playing game. This one says myth and mayhem role-playing. You can guess which games those are. And if you open them up, you are partially correct that nowhere does it actually say rule book, or very rarely does it say rule book. It usually does say things like guidebook or handbook or something like that. But there are rules, and the rules are very specific for game. It doesn't matter what game you're playing. If it is a game, it has rules. And there's some confusion between the definition of rule book and the definition of guidebook. Because normally when you think guidebook, you think guide on how to do things or guide on how to go something. A guidebook to your first day in Las Vegas. A guidebook on how to fly fish. A guidebook on cooking bread, as opposed to a rule book, the Hoyle's Book of Games, rules for card games, the rule book for Monopoly, the rule book for baseball. Very specific. So using that very specific, this individual would have you believe that game in question has no rules. I assume this individual didn't ever actually open any of the guidebooks, handbooks, manuals for tabletop role-playing game, because if they did, they would clearly see that there are rules. Now, just to be specific, let's use the OGL. We're all pretty familiar with the OGL now, without mentioning the game that OGL is based upon. Strength, Dex, Con, Intelligence, Wisdom, Charisma, Armor Class, Hit Points, Levels, Saving Throws, class-based D20 roleplay has very specific rules. Those rules involve character creation, leveling those characters, the abilities those characters get as they level, how things like combat is resolved, and how things like non-combat is resolved. Most of those non-existent rules center on a 20-sided dice. You roll the 20-sided dice, higher the better. Once that number is there, you then add any bonuses or minuses. You come up with a total. You tell the DM the total. the DM tells you the results, right? The rules say I get 1 attack a round. I'm going to take my attack. I roll a d20. I have +3 because of my strength. I'm using my longsword. I roll a 17 plus 3 is 18, 19, 20. All right. Does that hit? You got a 20? All right. Yes, he has an armor class of 13. Shadow, you definitely hit him. Okay. My longsword does a d8 plus 3 because of my strength, plus 1d6 because my longsword has a carrier attack. So I roll a d8. I roll a 5. I add d6 of 3. That's 8 plus 3 because of my strength. 9, 10, 11. 11 points of damage with my longsword. That is the rules. There are rules in the game. If it don't use the rules, you're not playing, and there are no rules. But so if you say you're using the rules, you're not playing. Even if you're homebrewing rules, you're still playing. And you're playing within a confined, preconceived, artificial reality where that reality has rules. Those rules are very clearly defined. Initiative, saving throw, combat, skill checks, leveling. It's right there. The rules for TTRPG are right there. So what do you mean that if I'm saying in their rules, I'm not playing? Because it says guidebook. It says handbook. It says game master's guide. Therefore, it's not a rule book. Therefore, you're not playing the game if you call it a rule book and if you play by the rules. Because I can really imagine what a game of baseball would be like without rules. I don't know how many innings. 4.5. We'll play until we get tired. How do we know who won? I don't know. You hit the ball and I don't know. I guess you run to that white thing over there. I don't know. There's no rules for this dumb game. So, yeah. There are no rules for tabletop role-playing games. If you say there are rules in tabletop role-playing games, it means you don't play tabletop role-playing game. Bonk, 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 bonk. I can't make this up. I wish I could. But there is somebody out there, whether they are 100% true or they're just a fucking troll vulture who's picking at the dead meat of somebody who managed to fall into their trap. On some level, even the worst of these bird brains believe this. And they engage in this nonsense to get attention, to get recognition, and to upset people and to troll people. And hindsight being 2020, Elven Maiden, she probably shouldn't have involved herself with this idiot because it's just a week's worth of frustration for herself. And all it ends up is accomplishing nothing other than this idiot has managed to upset people and get people to talk about them like me, which is, I guess, the end goal of these attention vultures, right? So if you really believe this, individual, I'd love to see how you play game, since you believe there are no rules for game. Please post a link to your most recent live play and what game you are using that doesn't actually have rules. All right, moving on to the next stupid thing for this week. These two kind of came hand in hand, and I'm pretty sure they're from the same person, even though that person is using 2 different accounts. It's our favorite idiot, or one of our favorite idiots. The OSR is pretty much dead. It's just old school gamers now. The OSR is just clones of old games. You do know what OSR stands for, correct? I'm going to guess you don't with statements like this. The OSR is pretty much dead. It's just old school gamers now. That's sort of the point of the OSR. The OSR is just clones of old games. And that's an insult. It hurts. This one hurts my brain. So let's go to the first one. The OSR is pretty much dead. It's just old school gamers now. All right, so this goes back to the old argument of when does the old school start and when does the old school end? When does it stop being an old school game and become a not old school game? Where is this imaginary line of demarcation where the old school ends? You can't keep calling it old school because a lot of those people aren't around anymore and a lot of those games don't exist anymore. Is it the 1970s to the 1980s was the old school? Is it the 1970s to the year 2000 was the old school? Is the old school anything before 2014? Is the old school any game that is in publication that isn't Dungeons and Dragons? Is Shadowrun an old school game? Is Shadowdark an old school game? Is whatever the most recent tabletop role-playing game that came out an old school game? Is it just any game that's not D&D? But old school role-playing means people who are playing older games, trying to relive or get older games back into awareness, or playing by a older style. Now, if you go by the third one, old school style, well, you could play any game past, present, or future using the old school style. I'm not sure what the old school style means still, because my old school style of the way we played in the 80s in California seems to be different than most other people's. But I guess it's referring to the way we played games in the 70s and 80s is the old school style. Now, you could have kids who are just starting to play, who are wanting to play that style. Again, I don't know what that means. For a lot of people, that means more grimdark, mudcore, hardcore, lethal role-playing. For others of us, that means really just ridiculous, over-the-top kind of rules as guidelines. I mean, you know, my old school and your old school are probably completely different, but still. Now, if you mean like, well, the old school is just clones of old games, well, yeah, that's sort of the point. That's how it originally started, okay? The D20 retro clones and retro clones of existing games is the bread and butter of the quote-unquote old school, okay? So this would also sort of paraphrase into the argument that there is not really any such thing as the old school. There's no tangible old school. There's nothing you could look at and go, that's the old school. If I look at a table, that's a table, right? It is a very tangible thing. But the old school is just sort of this amorphous idea that is perceived differently. But the general top of the old school definition is retro clones. Some of the very first old school publications were retro clones. And for the longest time, that's what old school meant to me and a lot of other people. Old school revival, bringing back games that aren't in print anymore or people didn't get a chance to play anymore. You know, in the 80s, 70s, 90s, there were a lot of games that you can't find anymore. And if you're like me, you want to, you know, revisit those games and you want to find other people who love those games and either don't have a copy or never got a chance to play it, but you really, really want to show them how to play. And that's kind of how it started, right? I mean, people were like, hey, Creeks and Crawdads, out of print. Can't find a game anywhere. I love that game. I would love to share it with people. I still have my copy of Creeks and Crawdads. This was a real game, by the way. What can I do? Oh, I can make a copy of it and make it available. And I have to make a couple changes to it so I don't get sued. So instead of calling it Creeks and Crawdads, I'm going to call it Adventures with Lobsters. And I'm going to change one or two things, and then I'm going to print it out. And here is my retro clone of Creeks and Crawdads. I'm calling it Adventures with Lobsters. Here's all the rules for Creeks and Crawdads, but I'm, you know, representing them with a few minor changes so I don't violate copyright or anything like that. But basically, here's the game. That's how it started. People wanted to play older versions of games or games that were out of print. So to say the OSR is just clones of games is absolutely 100% true. We're either trying to recreate pre-existing product add our own personal swing to pre-existing product. Take, for example, Basic Expert White Box, link down below, where he looked at Chainmail. He looked at the 3 original books for that game, put them all together, made a few subtle changes to it so that they all worked, and presented it as a brand new game, but the building blocks are on the old schooler games. So the OSR is pretty much dead. It's just old school gamers now. That would be the Nets, not old dead, because they're still playing. And the OSR is just clones of old games. Yes, that's totally the point of the old school. So if you're trying to troll me or insult me or insult people, you're not. You understand that? You're just dumb. These are pointless statements. That table is a table. Yeah, that old school game is a clone of an old school game. Yeah, Dungeon Crawl Classic is a clone of Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, with all the random tables added in, and then taking the random tables and adding more random tables. But at its basis, it's a clone of Dungeons and Dragons. Shadowdark, same thing. Mutants and Masterminds, same thing. Imperium, same thing. Retro clone of an old space game. G-Core, same thing. Retro clone of Phase Rip. All we're doing is either trying to recreate old games or a style and mentality of games. And anybody can play those games. Whether you be 15 years old playing your first game or 10,000 years old like me and you've been playing since the hobby started, it's just an appreciation of pre-existing games and an appreciation of any game that isn't Dungeons and Dragons 6th edition, an appreciation of a style of play. And that style of play pretty much, again, is anything that's not 2014 Wizards of the Coast D20. So before you can start insulting what the old school is, you need to define the old school. And you need to stop blaming the old school for everything's wrong with your life. The old school killed my dog. It's just an amorphous blob. It's an idea that people appreciate. I am an old school player because I like playing old games like Villains and Vigilantes. I am an old school publisher because I printed out games based upon an old D20 rule sets, specifically older D&D and Villains and Vigilantes. I am an old school gamer because I still play with the same style I played with in the 80s. It doesn't matter what game I'm playing, what game I'm running. I came up playing a specific style, and that's pretty much the specific style I still play. So yes, you're not insulting anybody. You're just basically stating the obvious. Rain is wet. The OSR is just a clone of old games. A table is used to support things. Ladders are tall. Cats are furry. The sun is bright. The old school is just clones of old games. There are no rules. Turns out there is no Shermer Illinois. Remember all those John Hughes films where all the chicks were choice and all the guys were losers, except for James Spader. He was hardcore. And they all took a place in this town called Shermer, Illinois. Well, me and Silent Bob, we got some money up together. We decided to head out to Shermer, Illinois, because we saw in all those movies, nobody was handling the blunt in Shermer, Illinois. Well, you know what happened when we got to Shermer, Illinois? Turns out there is no Shermer, Illinois. Turns out there are no rules Elvin made in. And if you say you're playing tabletop role-playing games, well, you're not, because we know there are no rules. And the only way to play tabletop role-playing game is to not play it with the non-existing rules. The first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. Does that hurt your brain? Because after that 20-minute rant, my brain is hurt. I mean, I get that people want to vulture, pick a target and try and anger people about something we love. And it's very easy to go after somebody's love for tabletop role-playing. And sadly, Elven Maiden got sucked into this bird's nest of idiocy. People post these ridiculous statements like the old school is just retro clones of old games, trying to get people angry, trying to say, hey, the old school did this, is this. The old school is, petty and vindictive, and they always pick on me. And if you play old school, you're racist, you're sexist, you're homophobic, you eat babies and dance with zombies. But now the arguments are just becoming dumb. Just plain old nonsensical stupid. So you're not winning your debate here, Pumpkin. You're just being dumb. Turns out there is no Shermer Illinois. Sidebar PSA, I want to thank everybody who's reached out to me over the past week about the comments Our Favorite Idiot has been making about me over the last 2 weeks. I am well aware of the comments Our Favorite Idiot has been making about me. I'm choosing not to engage. YouTube Legal has been made aware, as has my legal counsel. Steps are in process. So thank you very much. But hopefully this sad aspect of the ridiculousness that is my life will come to an end. I will now return you to your regularly scheduled ridiculousness for this Friday, a Super Bowl weekend. I hope whatever team you're voting for wins. And if you're not voting for either team, I hope you just can gather with some friends for the weekend and eat some food that's bad for you and celebrate the start of spring and take a brief moment to sort of forget the horrible spiral of nonsense that our beloved little planet is spiraling into. But don't worry about it, because remember, there are no rules. The old school is just old games, and there is no such thing as Shermer Illinois.